We have to remember that it's only been in the last 70 years that weapons existed where a single warhead would wipe out a city, or even a metropolitan area with a thermonuclear weapon. These last 70 years, in other words, are like no others in the history of humanity or the history of warfare. Since the end of the Cold War, people have not focused and worried about the possibility of an all-out nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia.
What we've decided to do is talk to each other instead of about each other.
Those who do follow it understand that the chance of an all-out war is possible. We could lower that risk quite significantly by eliminating our intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. We have currently 400 of those operational in silos on 10-minute alert. From getting an authenticated command to the time that the missiles are actually launched from their silos is a matter of minutes. Those missiles, of course, cannot be recalled. In about 30 minutes, they would land at their targets, largely in Russia and China. From the mid-1960s, when the Soviets had acquired sub-launched missiles, submarines, like ours, Polaris, that we could not target with our ICBMs became very vulnerable. And thus, both sides were on a hair-trigger, unstable, mutually threatening posture where each targeted on the other essentially on a launch-on-warning basis, and that's been true ever since. At that point, the ICBMs were no longer merely unnecessary and wasteful, as they are and always has been, but terribly dangerous. Much more so to us and to the world, even than the Polaris submarines, the Trident submarines, which we still have on both sides, which at least do not tempt either leadership to decision on a matter of minutes to set off all-out nuclear war. At the time that I was writing guidelines for the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in 1961, for the annual operational war plans of the United States, general nuclear war plans. At that point, the plan I was supplanting or modifying was the last plan left by the Eisenhower administration. His plan was simply to strike first in nuclear terms against the Soviet Union and China. The Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated in 1961 that the effects of our carrying out those plans, the Eisenhower plan, which was not a hypothetical plan for 10 years in the future or something, it was the annual operational plan for which the weapons existed and were on alert. They estimated it would kill 600 million people, 100 holocausts, 325 million in the Soviet Union and China alone, another 100 million in the satellite countries, the so-called captive nations, as Eisenhower called them, Hungary, Poland, the Warsaw Pact. Another 100 million of our allies in West Europe would be killed by the fallout from our attacks on the Soviet bloc. Without a single warhead of ours falling on West Europe, fallout from our attacks in the Soviet bloc would annihilate our NATO allies. Collateral damage, not desired, inadvertent, but expected. No way to avoid it. Now, when I saw that estimate in the White House, I thought that was the most evil planning that had ever existed in the history of humanity.
Our $50 billion defense program is explained by Secretary of Defense McNamara.
In the past year, we've doubled the rate of building Polaris submarines. We've doubled capacity to produce Minuteman missiles.
You can't have a large nuclear war of the kind we've prepared for and spent trillions of dollars preparing for, where the victims in that war would be limited to the adversaries or to any particular group of adversaries. For only the last 40 years of the nuclear era, we've known that smoke was a crucial effect, lethal effect of nuclear weapons. To take that into account would have increased that same estimate from their actual plans from 600 million to at least 1 billion, out of a population then of 3 billion, a third of the U.S. population. 20 years later, we learn that the cities that were targeted, all of them were targeted in the Soviet bloc, would have burned. The firestorms created by nuclear weapons would have lofted the smoke from these burning cities into the stratosphere. Quickly enveloped the globe within days or weeks and blot out most of the sunlight, not all of it, but about 70% of the sunlight, which would create winter, killing all harvests for at least several years and up to a decade or more, starving nearly everyone. Not quite everyone. It wouldn't be an extinction event. 98% gone within a year, starving to death. The people who were not at ground zero would have the experience of watching their children starve to death. The very possibility of a false alarm setting off all-out nuclear war is based on the possession and deployment and alerting of ICBMs. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, has said on many occasions that the danger of a false alarm causing a full-scale war between the United States and Russia specifically is the greatest existential risk facing humanity. What happened in 1979 was not just that enemy missiles were coming over the pole, but in a coordinated, synchronized way, missiles were coming from both oceans, from Russian Soviet submarines, and bombers were in the air. Now, how could that all be wrongly coming in? Exactly like a Soviet attack.
General, DBS is tracking 300 inbound Soviet ICBMs.
And the answer is that someone had put an actual simulation attack for testing the system into the operational system.
Tell me this is one of your simulations, Mr. Kittredge.
I don't think it's ever been explained 40 years later how that came about. William Perry was the Secretary of Defense at that time, and he was told on the phone at 3 a.m. about this incident, but he was told after it had been debunked. But he was told that 200 missiles were on the way, and he explained what he meant to do about that. He thought, well, 200, that must be aimed at our ICBMs in the world. So the interrogator asked, what would you have advised? He said, well, I think I would have advised Carter to send 200 or maybe 400 missiles at their ICBMs. That could not possibly do anything but set off the entire forces on both sides and destroy what they then thought was the Northern Hemisphere, which would in fact have been both hemispheres at that point. So we're talking about absurd responses in a situation that is essentially absurd in its, as I say, no language really does justice to this, but absurd is one word. Cataclysmic, catastrophic. Evil is another. Mad, insane. And that's where the world has been for more than 70 years. Months later, in 1980, still under President Carter, there were 2 other major alerts that went on for minutes. Well, those 3 major false alarms led Congress to call for investigation then of false alarms and discovered There had been hundreds and hundreds of false alarms which were not as serious as that. In 1983, during what the Russians regarded as a crisis period, President Andropov, at that time former head of the KGB, believed that Reagan intended a first strike. He was preparing for it, he threatened it, and they thought he was crazy. Colonel Stanislav Petrov got warning in his center that 5 American missiles, first 1, 2, then 5 American missiles were on their way from launch sites in America across the pole. His subordinates in that center, which was in the middle of the night, all believed that they were under attack. Red lights were going off. They were on the highest alert, panic, basically. And they were all urging him to report that Russia was under attack. Petrov wasn't sure that it was an attack. So he lied to his superiors. He said, it's a false alarm. He wasn't sure that it was. Then he waited 10 minutes to see whether they were all destroyed, not knowing whether it would be. Fortunately, he was right. It wasn't sure. He said it was about 50-50. And he felt sure that if he'd said 50-50, truthfully, they would have gone. That would have been enough to go. And we would not be here because of the nuclear winter effect. It's a possibility then, a real possibility, not zero and not close to zero, of all-out war actually occurring with our alert forces on the basis of a false alarm. There is only one weapon in our arsenal that confronts a president with the urgent decision of whether to launch nuclear war, and that is the decision to launch our ICBMs, because they are vulnerable in a way that our submarine launch weapons at sea are not vulnerable, they're invulnerable, and our planes can be called back. In fact, they don't even have to be called back. They can take off on positive control, it's called, and circle until they get a positive order to go ahead. They can do that for hours, actually, delaying any decision as to what the situation is. That's not true for ICBMs. They are fixed location, known to the Russians, and the Russians have missiles, both sub and ICBMs, as we do, that can destroy the fixed location ICBMs. It is solely their vulnerability that confronts the president with the challenge, use them or lose them. Eliminating ICBMs will not eliminate the existence, the occurrence of false alarms, but it will eliminate the response of blowing up the world in response to a false alarm. There will be no incentive for a president or a leader of any nuclear state to respond immediately, even to an actual attack, without any consideration. The ones who have weapons at sea that are invulnerable, and that includes China now and Russia as well as the U.S., have months to respond if necessary, and no incentive to do it immediately. So the idea then of blowing up the world because of a false alarm is due to the existence of ICBMs, basically. Should we have mutual elimination of ICBMs? Of course. But we don't need to wait for Russia to wake up to this reasoning that I'm giving here, to do what we can to reduce the risk of nuclear war, because it is the existence of ICBMs on both sides that keep both sides on high alert. And to remove ours is to eliminate not only the chance that we will use our ICBMs wrongly, but it also deprives the Russians of the fear that our ICBMs are on the way toward them. even if missiles are on the way, he is not about to lose submarine missiles, which are far more than enough to cause nuclear winter, let alone the destruction of societies. Same true for the bombers. But the ICBMs, he's confronted with the fact this $1 trillion investment over the years is about to go unless you decide to launch it. And the incentive to do that, the pressure on him to do that, has been testified to by a number of analysts, that in effect our military, our Strategic Air Command, now our Strategic Command, has always assumed that the president would execute, would go under these circumstances. And it would be pressed to do that. In fact, if he said, don't go, that would really raise a question of possible mutiny on that point. The prospect of, because of the president's reluctance of losing our whole ICBM force, would put our military under a great challenge as to whether they would obey him or not. That came up under Trump when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs considered whether to obey a presidential order.
America's top general, just 2 days after the January 6th Capitol insurrection, so worried about the then president's angry and erratic behavior, he called a secret meeting with top deputies, including the chain of command for the country's nuclear arsenal. General Mark Milley's message at that meeting: no one was to act on any orders for military strikes, even from the president, unless Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was personally involved in the sign-off as called for by Pentagon protocols.
General Milley was worried that the president might actually try to start a nuclear war, small or large, to distract from his imminent removal from office, having lost an election. And he actually was discussing with other officers whether they should be prepared to obey that or not obey it. That would be, in effect, mutiny. His having sole authority to do this worried people. And they began to investigate whether he could be restrained by other people, or whether it was really true that he could order this as a sole authority. And the answer to that is yes. And the answer to whether he could be constrained, no. Constitutionally, there could be a mutiny. In effect, there could be a refusal. But that person could be fired and immediately and replaced. And if the next person refused, again, that process could go on. Presidents, several times a year at least, rehearse the possibility of warning that will confront them with the decision whether or not to launch nuclear weapons. Remember that Hillary Clinton campaigned on the question against Obama, on the question of who the public wanted to respond to a 3 a.m. warning that Soviet missiles were on the way.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. Who do you want answering the phone?
I'm Hillary Clinton, and I approve this message.
It's the ICBMs alone that create this 3 a.m., 10-minute warning situation, which is, of course, absurd to think that a human can deal rationally or reasonably with such circumstances. I always need to repeat, given that no individual should have the capability of the challenge to destroy most life on Earth, or a third of life on Earth, or a tenth of life on Earth, and we have much more than that. If we eliminated ICBMs, then there would be no jamming, to use their word, jamming the president to act very swiftly. It is not the case that a enemy missile or a terrorist missile, anyone's missile, on Washington would paralyze our ability to respond. It has never been true. So without warning, Washington can be destroyed. That does not mean that there cannot be at all an authentic order to retaliate. And that's true for Russia, almost certainly true for every nuclear nation. Probably none of them permit their nuclear forces to be paralyzed by killing one person, whether it's Prime Minister Modi or the Pakistanis or the Israelis or anybody else. So there's a lot of fingers on a lot of buttons in the world. And that has been kept very secret from the public so as not to worry them. Our entire framework of nuclear weapons is based on the idea that, bad as it would be to strike first, preempt, it's less bad than to strike second. The Air Force doctrine, strategic doctrine, everything tells us that, and we build weapons to destroy enemy weapons as though they could limit damage to the United States if they went first before they were themselves destroyed. But it's not true. There is no possibility to limit damage any more than there is a possibility to win by either side. Especially, that's really true even without the smoke, but with the smoke of nuclear winter, no, it is not better to go first than second. The truth is that our nuclear policies from the beginning, especially from the time that Russia acquired nuclear weapons in 1949, which was approximately the same time as NATO was building its policy on first-use threat of nuclear weapons to defend Europe. A policy of threatening first use against a nuclear-armed nation, the Soviet Union, is a threat of an insane action.
The U.S. and NATO are beginning nuclear drills today and take place amid Russia conducting its own nuclear exercises.
Our policy has been nothing other than a madman policy. It's not only Nixon, and it's not only Trump, who said openly he wanted to appear unpredictable, random. He might do anything so as to get his way in foreign affairs. All of our presidents have made nuclear threats. Our NATO policy has been based on that every day since the early 50s. If necessary, we would initiate nuclear war against Russia, which would destroy most life on Earth. Now, it's a threat of an insane action. Is that insane in itself?
NATO kicks off nuclear training exercises in Europe. The pre-planned drills taking place in Belgium, the North Sea and the United Kingdom, involving 14 countries with up to 60 aircraft, including US B-52 long-range bombers. Russia's holding its own nuclear drills this month, likely to also include live missiles like previous years.
The weapons actually are designed to kill people, or to threaten to kill people, which is the way they've actually been used a number of times, quite specifically in crises. The way you use a gun when you point it at someone in a confrontation. You are using the gun. If you get your way without pulling the trigger, that's the best use of the gun. The threats can work. Of course they can work. When you point a gun, whether you're a policeman or a vigilante or a bandit going into a 7-Eleven, no legitimacy, whatever, but of course you can walk out with the contents of the cash register. It can work. And these threats can work and have worked. But in this case, what's at stake is not just the person who is being targeted in this confrontation. It's not even the enemy nation. All of our NATO allies, as well as our Congress, have always based their policy on the notion, no, this is the best policy, this is right, costs less than some others, it's effective, it's the way to keep the Russians from doing it. You're going on the basis of the fact that a threat and a readiness and a preparation and a rehearsal of causing nuclear winter and destroying most large life on Earth, total extinction of other large animals that are less adaptable than humans are, is a reasonable policy. That is insane, and you have to call it a kind of ordinary insanity because it's so widely shared.
The result of a decision the president would make is so grotesquely horrible, It would change the face of the earth. It would change humanity, it would change mankind. And I guess when you're on duty, you try not to think about the import of that, but you're fully prepared to do so if you have to.
To have machinery, a system of bombers, missiles, airplanes, and submarine launch missiles designed to produce this effect under some circumstances, if ordered, or if not ordered, but set off by someone has no justification. Obviously, words do not exist in human language to describe that sort of decision or that sort of machinery. As Herman Kahn coined the phrase doomsday machine, and I use that in my title of my book, about the plans I was working on at that point, to my shame now that I was involved in that. But obviously, there is no conceivable justification, even as a threat, for having that capability or that likelihood as we do. We're continuing year by year, deliberately, with a posture and a policy and threats that make a non-zero significant risk of near extinction possible. The idea of war between the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. and China, which both sides are preparing for, should not be a human prospect. But it is. Our country, the first to use nuclear weapons against humans in explosions, has led the way at every step of the way here in the escalation of the arms race. And the Russians, with absolutely equal unwisdom, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which we humiliated them, and they were led foolishly to believe that that was a result of our superiority in nuclear weapons. So they built a doomsday machine. Is their policy better than ours? No, that's part of the problem. So we either change course. It will not come from within the Pentagon. It will not come from people who take more seriously their economic and political relations to Northrop Grumman than they do to the survival of humanity. We are now engaged in modernizing it, that is, replacing the doomsday machine with a whole new set of submarines, ballistic missiles, ICBMs, bombers, at the cost of estimated $1.7 trillion, almost certainly to be enormously more than that.
We initially thought the price for Sentinel would be about $95 billion. Now the Air Force reports that it will be $132 billion, nearly 40% more. Why
are we thinking of spending $250 billion over the next 30 years, $100 billion in the next 10 years, to produce a replacement for the Minuteman III, when we should eliminate the Minuteman III, the current ICBMs, altogether, rather than replacing them? Why is it? Mainly because it's profitable to Northrop Grumman or its rivals, Boeing or Lockheed, who have channels of influence, who have, in effect, bought influence, and let's be frank, bought congressmen. Congress could so easily be deluded into thinking those ICBMs were necessary, deluded by campaign contributions and by advertising by the military-industrial complex, and the influence of that ever since. Something I have to say that as somebody who's followed this process actively and as a participant for more than half a century, I've come to realize that I greatly underrated the role of the industrial part of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government.
They have carefully distributed the earnings from that and the jobs and the votes and everything across 35 states, and thus has support from unions in many of those states, and definitely from senators and congressmen in every district where that production carries on. So it's votes, it's campaign donations to the congresspeople, it's revolving door jobs between the highest level military and these corporations. The present Secretary of Defense, for example, comes from the board of Raytheon Corporation. He was preceded by Esper from Boeing and Mattis, others, all of these from the boards of these top corporations. People who are expert in the military-industrial complex, much more than I, except on the military part of it. They say that almost no major weapons program has been stopped once a sizable amount of money has been invested in producing it. That's why there's often great pressure to start producing even before the design is perfected, to get it locked in so it can't be reversed. And so we have programs, as I say, like the F-35, enormously over contract, cost overruns, technical problems altogether. You just can't stop it. And this goes back 20 years. Senator McCain, when he was head of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, a man of whom it was said there was hardly any conflict, he was not in favor of any war or any weapon, tried to stop the F-35. It was too much even for McCain, and he couldn't. He failed.
The Arizona Republican called out the F-35 Joint Strike stealth fighter's troubled history Thursday during a hearing on the program. The program's price tag is nearly $400 billion for nearly 2,500 planes. That's almost twice the original estimate.
The F-35's program's record of performance has been both a scandal and a tragedy with respect to cost, schedule, and performance.
There should have been an effort all along, going back at least, as I say, 50 years, to abandon the ICBM when it became, as I say, not only totally anachronistic compared to the sub-launched missiles, but, as I say, increasingly dangerous. In fact, in the case of the ICBM, we would be safer and the money would be better spent paying Northrop Grumman not to produce the ICBM. Some part of that money would be well spent dismantling the current ICBMs, the Minuteman III, and that can't be done too soon. The highly motivated delusion that missiles like earlier the MX, the Minuteman III, the new missile that we're being asked now to design, the ground-based strategic deterrent program, are necessary and useful. That is a delusion. The profitable delusion has meant trillions of dollars of sales to Northrop Grumman, to Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, General Dynamics.
There's at least one industry that's booming right now, and it will keep booming regardless of what happens with the Fed in particular or the U.S. economy in general. And I'm talking about the defense industry, which is on fire. Perhaps you may think for all the wrong reasons, but it's on fire.
Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed, Raytheon, and the people who they talk to in the government and influence and hire and buy have failed humanity, failed all of us. The most effective action taken in all the years of the Vietnam War was the so-called moratorium action, which was a rename of a general strike.
The word protester generally evokes an image of long hair and love beads. But today, the crowds that marched and chanted and cheered the speeches look more like a cross-section picked by the Census Bureau.
This was the look of the land today, from one coast to the other.
The people organizing it felt general strikes sounded too radical. And so they called it a moratorium, an end to business as usual. And they called for people to take off from school and work on a weekday, all together, all across the country. 2 million people did that. It was a general strike. On October 15th, 1969, a time when Richard Nixon secretly, without their knowledge or my knowledge, I was copying the Pentagon Papers then, but not because I knew what Nixon was threatening then. Hardly anyone did. He was threatening nuclear war. And the reason he didn't carry it out in early November was 2 million people in the streets on a weekday on October 15th, and this prospect of a 2-day general strike in November, and then a 3-day in December. And I can even mention that when I was talking to Greta Thunberg in Sweden, I ventured to make one suggestion to her. I did not suggest that she change her focus at all to take on the problem I was obsessed with, the nuclear problem. But I had one suggestion. I told her about the moratorium. And I said, rather than just have one day a week, Friday, where a year later she had 15 million people on one day, I said, do what the moratorium, think of doing 2 days the next month, 3 days a month after that, and keep the pressure on. I think actually nothing less than a general strike will cause this. Can you call that? You can't just call that into being. On the nuclear issue, there is no basis whatever for alerting people to that now because they don't have a sense. Climate, yes, they do have that awareness. And yet, with millions of people, with Extinction Rebellion, with the many, many activist efforts that have been going on, they have not changed policy at all. And we have to do better, in effect. Can we? We don't know. No one knows. Can humanity survive the nuclear era? We don't know. I choose to act as if we have a chance.